J.P. Morgan's secret about the CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, exposed. We all know how the CBDC can turn our lives into an Orwellian nightmare. George Gammon explains why the Fed won't issue CBDCs. J.P. Morgan will. Let's rejoice, because the absurd insanity we are experiencing is forcing more and more people to awaken. However, we must have compassion for those who are incapable of awakening, because the injections have created a separation from the individual soul. The only way out of the matrix is absolute non-compliance. The CBDCs will make it impossible to function in the system. I'm not interested in survival, which leads to inevitable death. I choose to live at all costs. I'm absolutely certain that the courageous ones must choose to get out of the matrix completely by November 2023. Please view the many videos I created on the time wave spirals. I was blessed because my jail experience forced me to leave Canada and what appeared to be a perfect life as a very successful dentist and mother of 2 wonderful children. One needs great courage to jump into the complete unknown, but it is an absolute necessity in this evolutionary crisis. Today, I'm in a position to assist individuals who choose life. Just 2 kilometers from our farm, I discovered a small development. One can purchase a lot of 1,000 meters square and a 3-bedroom house for $60,000 US at today's rate of exchange. While your home is under construction, you can start developing the agriculture of such an inchy nut, avocados, pineapple, yucca, papaya, bananas, citrus fruit, and a vegetable garden. One can raise chickens and other small animals. A long-term stay at Cascada Café Retiro is $300 US per month. I also offer dentistry, including complex full mouth reconstruction at a cost of 35% of European and North American prices. The global prison planet is being dismantled, and we have the honor of witnessing this. I conclude by encouraging you to continue your inner evolution despite the current world scenario, which can seem worrying when we forget that the divine is behind everything and that the supramental world is at our doorstep. Please share my videos. Infinite Love. Step number 1. Who owns the Federal Reserve? The Federal Reserve System is a network of 12 banks in different regions throughout the United States. The New York Fed is the main hub. That is the main central bank. Each one of these reserve banks are individually operated, and they are individually owned by the member banks within the region. At the Federal Reserve website, in the frequently asked questions, they have the question, who owns the Federal Reserve? In the first sentence they say, the Federal Reserve System is not owned by anyone. But then, in the same blog post, they go on to say, for instance, each of the 12 reserve banks operates within its own particular area or district of the United States, and each is separately incorporated and has its own board of directors. Of course, last time I checked, if you are incorporated, you would definitely have an owner. Commercial banks that are members of the Federal Reserve System hold stock in their district's reserve bank. Again, last time I checked, if they hold the stock, the shareholders were the owners of the corporation. However, they say owning reserve bank stock is quite different from owning stock in a private company. The reserve banks are not operated for profit, and ownership of a certain amount of stock is, by law, a condition of membership in the system. So what they're saying is that these shares that the banks own, they don't really mean anything. They don't do anything. They're just completely irrelevant. But you have to own them to be a member. Right. Because they specifically say they are not operated for profit. They give all the money to the US Treasury, except, of course, all the necessary expenses, and they are legally required to make dividend payment and maintain a limited balance in a surplus fund. Okay, clearly nothing to see here, so let's move on. They have been successful at this lying game for over 100 years. The banksters are printing money out of thin air and giving themselves, in the form of dividends, whatever they want. Many will make the argument that the banksters are controlled by the government. Okay, so then who controls the politicians? That would be the bankers, and more specifically, Jamie Dimon, that runs J.P. Morgan. Whoever owns the most shares owns the Fed. And the biggest bank is J.P. Morgan Chase. Therefore, is it any surprise that J.P. Morgan took over First Republic Bank? The big get even bigger. J.P. Morgan gets a sweetheart deal. Apparently, right now, the Fed is losing money for the first time in 107 years. If the Fed is losing money, that means that JP Morgan is making more money, as explained by George. Whether the Fed makes or loses money, JP Morgan always wins. Heads, I win. Tails, you lose. Step number 2. If you listen to the mainstream media, you will hear that it was an aggressive bidding war between all these banks for the assets of First Republic Bank. They say J.P. Morgan just barely won because they were willing to take the most risk. The media makes it sound as if we should thank Jamie Dimon. Let's look at some details. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation agreed to absorb most of the losses on the mortgages and commercial loans that JP Morgan is getting, and also provided it with $50 billion credit line. Furthermore, the acquisition will add over $500 million of profit annually to JP Morgan, and it has already booked a one-time gain of about $2.6 billion. The mainstream media is trying to convince us that this was the best deal. Of course, there was no other bank willing to take, well, let's say $450 million annual profit or a one-time gain of $2.5 billion instead of $2.6 billion. Right again. All this nonsense is quite easy when you own the central bank and all of the politicians. The monetary system broke in 2008. It was never fixed, and it is getting progressively worse. If we have a broken monetary system, it is easy to see that banks will continue to go bust. This is the bank failures as a stacked bar chart in 2008 compared to now in 2023. The bank failures in 2023 have already exceeded the great financial crisis of 2008, and we are only in May. Many banks will continue to go bust in the months to come, and most of them will go over to J.P. Morgan. Jamie Dimon's ownership of the Federal Reserve will continually increase. Step number 3. How do we go from worrying about FedCoin to worrying about Jcoin? J.P. Morgan will be the issuer of the CBDC. Here's a question. When was the world's first CBDC created? It was over 100 years ago, in 1922. More on this later on. Once JP Morgan owns all the banks, it will own all the shares in the Federal Reserve. Therefore, it will be a 100% owner. What is going on is a merger. Of course, this will not happen in 2023, but it may happen within this decade, let's say by 2030, especially when you consider the fragility of today's monetary system. If JP Morgan is the last man standing, it will have all the deposits. Everything is now a giant mega bank. When that happens, we will have a central bank digital currency. For a better explanation, let's go back to the first CBDC set up in 1922. At Wikipedia, we find Gazbank, the state bank of the USSR, the central bank of the Soviet Union, and the only bank in the entire country from 1922 to 1991. They basically had the exact same system in communist Russia as was described previously, assuming J.P. Morgan takes control of all the banks. All the deposits are in one ledger. The Soviet state used Gazbank primarily as a tool to impose centralized control upon industry in general, using bank balances and transaction histories to monitor the activity of individual concerns and their compliance with 5-year plans and directives of the government. Sounds exactly like a central bank digital currency, doesn't it? Gazbank did not act as a commercial bank in regard to the profit motive. It acted theoretically as an instrument of government policy. Instead of independently and impartially assessing the creditworthiness of the borrower, Gazbank would provide loan funds to favored individuals, groups, and industries as directed by the central government. So all of the concerns of CBDCs came into fruition in 1922. How was this done? Did they have the needed technology back then? No, absolutely not. The reason they were able to achieve this Orwellian nightmare is because all the deposits were on one ledger. None of us want a CBDC. None of us want that Orwellian nightmare. None of us want the government micromanaging every single part of our lives. What we have to focus on is not necessarily something called the CBDC. It's simply moving all the deposits into one ledger. That is what we have to avoid at all costs. The central planners, the Klaus Schwab types, the IMF, the politicians, the UN, the EU, etc., they're not stupid. They understand that the term CBDC has negative connotations. So if they want to achieve their Orwellian dream, they will not come right out and say, we are implementing this thing called FedCoin or even J-Coin. What they will do is say, for your safety, for your security, we need to move all these deposits onto one ledger. And all those people that are hyper-focused on CBDCs will say, okay, Jerome Powell, okay, Jamie Dimon, do what you need to do to secure my deposits. Just don't do the CBDCs. Then that same average Joe wakes up 6 months later, and all of a sudden, he has a social score. And even if he had a 750 credit score, he can't get a mortgage. There is an old saying, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he didn't exist. Now we can say the greatest trick the central planners and authoritarians have ever pulled is convincing the world a CBDC does exist. It's not the central bank digital currency we should be worried about. It's the central bank digital ledger system. The global prison planet is being dismantled, and we have the honor of witnessing this. I conclude by encouraging you to continue your inner evolution despite the current world scenario, which can seem worrying when we forget that the divine is behind everything and that the supramental world is at our doorstep. Please share my videos. Infinite love.